Next, let's think about theology in terms of ethics. What was the original author, and God through the original author, teaching to the original audience about what to believe or to know, about what to feel, and about what to do? So let's think about this. We're going to look at our three examples. We're going to go back to Genesis 21 and think in terms of ethics about know, believe, feel, and do. And so again, Genesis 21, I think what one of the things, or some of the things that God was wanting to communicate to the original audience, the Israelites in the desert, wandering in the desert, about again the story in Genesis 21 with Hagar and Ishmael, or Ishmael and Hagar, yes, is that God would provide for them as covenant children, that they would know, or that they would believe that God would provide for them. Those wandering Israelites in the wilderness, that God would provide for them as covenant children. That God hears their cries of desperation, because they certainly cried out while they were in the wilderness. And that God will make them into a great nation despite their inadequate provisions. That they would know and believe that. Again, their story so closely aligns with the story of Hagar and Ishmael in their trek into the wilderness with meager provisions. But here we have this covenant nation now, and that God will make them into a great nation, just like it was promised to Ishmael, despite their inadequate provisions, just like Ishmael. That they would feel desperate, yet grateful that God does hear and provides. I don't think God wanted the Israelites to not see their desperation. In fact, we can see in another passage that God actually was testing them. So he wanted them to feel desperate, but yet grateful. The problem that they missed in the wilderness is that they were desperate and they complained. They weren't desperate yet grateful that God does hear and provides. And that they would turn then their cries of complaining into open-handed prayers, and that they would look to him for their provision instead of looking to their lack. And so that's Genesis 21. Let's look at Luke 7. So in Luke 7, I think what the original audience was being called to know or believe is that Jesus is God and longs to forgive those who come to him in their need. That Jesus always welcomes the outcast who comes to him in their desperation. That self-righteousness hinders genuine love and worship, and that Jesus gives peace. What I think that they were being called to feel was genuine gratitude and worship for being greatly forgiven, which is what the woman demonstrated. And that they would feel the peace of Christ that comes from being forgiven. And what he was calling them to do is to recognize their great sin, which Simon couldn't recognize, but the woman did. Recognize their great sin and come to him in their desperate need for forgiveness. And I would add to that, to be greatly forgiven. To forsake pride and self-righteousness. So I think this passage was a warning. Simon was a warning to future believers, to believers that were specifically this was being written to in the first place, that they would forsake any pride and self-righteousness that was seeping into their lives, and to worship and love Christ out of response to his forgiveness. Again, what we see in this woman is that she comes with uncontrolled worship and love for Christ. And so she is the example of what then we are being called, or what believers, the original audience, was being called to. And then the last one is Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And again, what they were being called to know and believe, again, there's plenty of things here, but I just listed 4. That apart from Christ, they were desperately lost and under God's wrath. But that God, in his grace and mercy, made them alive, raised them up with Christ, and they will forever be the objects of his grace and kindness. That all of this happened simply by grace through faith. And it happened so that they now would walk in good works prepared for them. What they were to feel, again, I think I'm guessing here a little bit, but I think by the tone of what's going on, I think they were called to feel exceedingly grateful for God's saving grace. They were to feel humbled and worshipful because of God's gracious hand in saving them in their sins. And I think one of the reasons that Paul wrote this little section to believers in Ephesus, again, he didn't write this to unbelievers, but to believers, was to be a reminder. Because so often we can forget. We can forget who we were, we can forget who we were created for. And in light of those things, then we could feel calloused to Christ and to the great forgiveness that we have and to the riches of his love for us. And so I think we can move from a place of where we once felt gratitude, now we just kind of feel indifferent. So I think what Paul is doing here is calling them back to a gratitude and a humble worship. And then what to do is, again, there's no commands in this passage, but I think inherent in this, or intrinsic in this, is that they were called to walk out the good works they were recreated for. So even though there's no commands, I think implicit in this is that they were called to walk out the good works they were created for.